Never save money, a grandfather's life lesson, motivational story about work and wisdom. If you have ever been told to save every coin and hide it away for a rainy day that never comes, this story will change the way you see money forever. This is the tale of an old man, his grandson, and a lesson that turned poverty into purpose. Before we begin, if stories like this speak to something in you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Every subscriber helps this message reach someone who needs to hear it tonight. Now, let us begin. Lesson 1. The Old Man Who Never Grew Rich. In a small village surrounded by dry hills and quiet rivers, there lived an old carpenter named Elias. He was known throughout the region not for his wealth, for he had none, but for the wisdom that fell from his mouth like sawdust from his hands. His grandson, Micah, was 17 and desperate to leave the village, convinced that money hidden under a mattress was the only path to safety. Micah had watched his father struggle, his mother worry, and he had promised himself that he would never be poor again. So he saved. He saved every coin he earned sweeping floors at the market, hiding them in a tin box beneath his bed, refusing to spend on anything that did not feel like survival. One evening, Elias found the boy counting his coins by candlelight, his face tight with the kind of fear that comes from growing up without enough. The old man sat beside him, his joints cracking against the wooden stool, and asked a question that would haunt Micah for years to come. He asked, "Boy, what do you think that box will become when you are my age?" Micah answered proudly that it would become a fortune, a wall against hunger, a shield against the world's cruelty. Elias only shook his head slowly and said nothing more that night, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. Lesson 2. The Jar That Never Filled. Weeks passed, and Micah noticed something strange about his grandfather's house. There were no jars of coins, no hidden boxes, no secret stashes beneath floorboards. Instead there were tools, books, half-finished chairs, and sketches of machines Elias had never built. Curious and slightly judgmental, Micah asked him directly why a man of 70 had nothing saved after a lifetime of work. Elias laughed, a dry laugh that turned into a cough, and told him a story about a jar he once owned as a young man. He explained that as a boy, he too had kept a jar, filling it with every spare coin, watching it grow heavier month after month. But the jar never truly filled, because no matter how much he saved, life demanded more than the jar could hold. A drought came, and the jar could not grow food. A sickness struck his mother, and the jar could not heal her faster than the money ran out. He realized then that a jar of coins was only a jar of dead metal unless it was transformed into something living, something that could grow on its own. Money sitting still, he told Micah, is a soldier standing guard over nothing, while money put to work is a soldier that multiplies the army behind it. Lesson 3. The Difference Between Hoarding and Building. Micah pushed back, as any frightened young man would. He asked his grandfather how spending money instead of saving it could possibly make a person safer. Was this not reckless? Was this not the very behavior that ruined careless men in the village who drank away their wages and left their families hungry? Elias nodded, understanding the confusion, and clarified that he was not preaching recklessness. He was preaching direction. There is a profound difference, he said, between hoarding money out of fear and building something out of purpose. The old man explained that hoarding is driven by anxiety, a belief that the world is only ever taking and never giving, so one must clutch tightly to whatever they have. Building, however, is driven by vision, a belief that resources exist to be shaped into something greater than their original form. A man who hoards 100 coins will always have 100 coins, slowly eaten away by time and inflation and misfortune. A man who builds with 100 coins might turn them into tools, and those tools into a trade, and that trade into a livelihood that feeds generations. The coins themselves are meaningless, Elias insisted. It is the direction they are pointed that determines whether a man rises or merely survives. Subscribe to this channel now if this story is starting to shift something in you, because the lessons only get deeper from here. Lesson 4. The Carpenter's Secret Investment. Elias then told Micah about the years following his own father's death, when he inherited nothing but a broken workbench and a single chisel. Every other young man in his position would have taken odd jobs, saved every coin, and lived in fear for decades. Instead, Elias made a decision that many in the village called foolish. He spent almost everything he had, including borrowed money, on lessons from a master carpenter 3 villages away, a man known for building furniture that lasted for generations rather than falling apart within a season. For 2 years, Elias walked 6 hours each way to learn from this master, sacrificing meals, sacrificing comfort, sacrificing the appearance of financial safety that a fat coin purse might have given him. His neighbors mocked him, calling him a dreamer who would die poor and foolish. But Elias understood something they did not. He was not spending money. He was planting it. Every hour of instruction, every technique learned, every callus formed on his hands was a seed buried in soil that would eventually bear fruit far greater than any jar of coins could produce. By the time he returned home permanently, he could build furniture no other carpenter in the region could match, and orders began arriving from towns he had never even visited. Lesson 5. Skill is the only currency that cannot be stolen. Micah sat quietly, absorbing the story, but still clinging to his fear. He admitted that his grandfather's gamble had worked, but what if it had failed? What if the master carpenter had been a fraud, or the skills had not translated into income? Elias respected the question, for it was the same question every generation must wrestle with before they can move forward. He answered with a truth he had carried his entire life. Money can be stolen, burned, devalued, or lost to disaster, but a skill embedded in your hands and mind cannot be taken from you by any thief, any fire, or any economic collapse. He reminded Micah of families in the village who had lost everything during the Great Flood many years earlier, their coins washed away, their homes destroyed. Yet those who had valuable skills, whether in healing, building, farming, or teaching, rebuilt their lives within a few short years. Those who had only hoarded coins, with no trade to lean on, remained impoverished long after the floodwaters receded, because their entire identity and security had been tied to something as fragile as currency. Elias explained that true wealth is not what sits in a box beneath your bed, but what lives inside your own two hands and your own sharpened mind, ready to be deployed no matter what the world throws at you. Lesson 6. The Trap of Financial Fear. As the weeks passed, Micah began spending less time guarding his tin box and more time listening to his grandfather's stories each evening after work. He noticed a pattern emerging in every tale Elias told him. Fear, more than poverty itself, was the true enemy that kept people trapped in cycles of struggle. Elias described watching men his age hoard every coin out of terror, refusing to invest in tools, education, or opportunities, only to die with slightly more money than they started with, but having wasted an entire lifetime avoiding the very risks that could have transformed their families forever. He explained that fear disguises itself as wisdom. It whispers that saving is always safe and spending is always dangerous, when in truth, both saving and spending can be reckless or wise depending entirely on their purpose. A man who saves obsessively while his children go without proper education is not being wise, he is being fearful, and fear rarely produces prosperity. A man who spends wisely on skills, relationships, health, and opportunities, even when it feels uncomfortable, is planting seeds that fear alone could never grow. Elias told Micah that the question was never whether to save or spend, but whether each decision moved him closer to becoming a man capable of creating value, or simply a man capable of hiding from the world. If this message is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Let us continue. Lesson 7. Investing in people, not just possessions. One autumn evening, as they sat outside watching the sun disappear behind the hills, Elias told Micah about the poorest and richest decision of his life, made on the very same day. A young widow in the village, a stranger to him at the time, had lost her husband and her only source of income within the same season. Elias, still struggling financially himself, chose to give her a portion of his savings without expecting repayment, along with an offer to teach her son his trade free of charge. His own wife questioned the decision, worried they could not afford such generosity. But Elias explained that money given freely to lift another person rarely disappears completely, it simply changes form. Years later, that same widow's son became one of the finest craftsmen in the region and, remembering the kindness shown to his mother, sent customers, resources, and eventually his own daughter to study under Elias's family for generations. The old man told Micah that investing in people, through generosity, mentorship, and genuine care, often returns far more than any bank or business ever could, because human gratitude and loyalty compound in ways that money alone never can. Lesson 8. The danger of comparing your beginning to someone else's middle. Micah confessed one night that he often compared himself to wealthier boys in the village, sons of merchants who never had to sweep floors or count coins by candlelight. He admitted feeling ashamed of his slow progress and his empty pockets. Elias listened patiently before sharing a truth that reshaped how Micah viewed his entire journey. He explained that comparing your beginning to someone else's middle is one of the cruelest tricks the mind can play on itself. The merchant's sons Micah envied had inherited decades of family effort, resources, and connections built by fathers and grandfathers who had sacrificed long before these boys were born. Micah was witnessing only the current chapter of their story, mistaking it for the entire book. Elias reminded him that his own hardship, his sweeping of floors, his careful counting of coins, his hunger to learn, were not signs of failure but the very foundation stones of a future strength that inherited wealth could never replicate. He told Micah that men who are handed everything rarely develop the resilience required to rebuild when disaster strikes, while men who claw their way up from nothing become nearly impossible to break. The comparison Micah should be making, Elias insisted, was not to other boys, but to the version of himself from a year ago. Lesson 9. Time is the real currency. As Micah grew older and began earning more from his own emerging carpentry skills, Elias noticed him falling into old patterns, working excessive hours purely to accumulate more coins, sacrificing sleep, health, and relationships in the process. One evening, exhausted and irritable, Micah snapped at his grandfather for questioning his work ethic. Elias did not raise his voice in response. Instead, he asked Micah a simple question that stopped him cold. What good is a growing coin purse if the man carrying it collapses from exhaustion before he can enjoy it? Elias explained that time, not money, was the true currency of a human life. Coins could always be earned again, but hours spent were gone forever, never to be reclaimed no matter how much wealth a man accumulated. He shared the story of a wealthy merchant in a neighboring town who had worked himself into illness chasing profit, only to spend his final years too frail to enjoy the fortune he had built, watching from his bed as others spent what he could no longer use. Elias warned Micah that the wisest men learn to spend their time as carefully as their money, understanding that health, rest, and relationships were investments that paid dividends no coin ever could. Lesson 10. Debt used with purpose versus debt used from desperation. A turning point in Micah's life arrived when he was offered the chance to purchase quality tools from a retiring craftsman, tools that would allow him to take on larger, more profitable commissions. The price was more than he had saved, and taking a loan felt terrifying after years of fearing debt above all else. He asked his grandfather whether borrowing money was a betrayal of everything he had been taught. Elias smiled, recognizing the fear in his grandson's voice as the same fear he himself had once carried. He explained that debt itself was neither good nor evil, but a tool whose value depended entirely on its purpose. Debt taken to fund reckless spending or fleeting pleasures was a chain that would eventually strangle its holder. But debt taken to acquire tools, education, or opportunities that would generate far more value than the debt itself was a ladder, not a chain. Elias encouraged Micah to calculate honestly whether the tools would earn back their cost within a reasonable time, and whether he had the discipline to repay what he borrowed. When Micah confirmed both, Elias told him to take the loan without shame, for a ladder used wisely lifts a man far higher than fear ever could keep him safe. This story is only getting more powerful from here, so if you have not subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Let us continue toward the heart of this lesson. Lesson 11. The illusion of security. Years passed, and Micah's carpentry business grew steadily, though never without struggle. One particularly difficult season, a wealthy trader from the city visited the village, mocking the smallness of Micah's workshop compared to his own sprawling warehouses filled with saved gold and hoarded goods. Micah felt a familiar sting of inadequacy and shared his frustration with his grandfather that evening. Elias, now well into his 80s, offered a warning that would prove prophetic within the year. He explained that security built purely on hoarded wealth is often the most fragile security of all, because it depends entirely on external conditions remaining unchanged forever. True security, he insisted, comes from adaptable skill, diverse relationships, and the proven ability to create value even when circumstances shift beneath your feet. Sure enough, within the year, a change in trade routes and a sudden market collapse destroyed much of the wealthy trader's hoarded fortune overnight, while Micah's smaller but skill-based business, rooted in genuine craftsmanship and community trust, continued steadily forward. Elias reminded Micah that the tortoise of adaptable skill nearly always outlasts the hare of hoarded, brittle wealth when true storms eventually arrive, as they always do. Lesson 12. Generosity is a multiplier. By the time Micah reached his 30s, his workshop had grown into one of the most respected in the region, employing several young apprentices from struggling families. Remembering his grandfather's story of the widow so many years earlier, Micah made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than hoarding his growing profits purely for personal comfort, he began offering free apprenticeships to boys from the poorest families in the village, just as Elias had once offered his own knowledge freely to others. Many questioned this decision, warning Micah that he was giving away valuable knowledge to potential future competitors. But Micah had learned enough from his grandfather to understand a deeper truth. Every apprentice he trained became a walking advertisement for his workshop's quality, a future customer, and often a lifelong ally rather than a threat. Word spread throughout the region of the generous craftsman who lifted others rather than guarding his knowledge jealously, and customers began seeking him out specifically because of his reputation for building people alongside furniture. Elias, watching his grandson repeat the same generous pattern he himself had modeled decades earlier, felt a quiet pride that no amount of hoarded coin could have ever replaced. Lesson 13. When the old man grew weak. As Elias entered his final years, his body weakened, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. Micah, now a successful craftsman with a family of his own, sat by his grandfather's bedside one evening, overwhelmed with gratitude for the lessons that had shaped his entire life. He asked Elias directly whether he had any regrets about never accumulating the kind of wealth the merchants and traders had built during his lifetime. Elias, though frail, managed a genuine smile as he answered. He explained that he measured his wealth not in coins left behind, but in the lives he had touched, the skills he had passed forward, and the character he had built within himself and his grandson. He reminded Micah that coins left in a box after death benefit no one, decaying quietly while heirs argue over inheritance, but skills, wisdom, and generosity planted in living people continue growing long after the original giver has passed away. He told Micah that his true fortune was sitting right beside his bed in the form of a grandson who understood the difference between hoarding and building, and that no jar of coins could ever compare to that legacy. If you have made it this far into the story, please consider subscribing to this channel, because stories like this one exist to help you build a legacy far greater than any bank account ever could. Lesson 14. The Final Conversation. On what would become their final evening together, Elias called Micah close and shared one last teaching, quieter and more personal than all the others before it. He admitted that the phrase he had lived by his entire life, the idea to never simply save money, had often been misunderstood by those in the village who assumed he meant reckless spending or careless disregard for the future. He clarified for Micah, so that the lesson would be carried forward accurately, that the true meaning was never about avoiding preparation for tomorrow. The true meaning, Elias explained, was to never let money sit idle out of fear alone, never to hoard simply because hoarding felt safer than growth, and never to mistake a growing pile of coins for a growing life. Saving with purpose, toward a specific tool, skill, or opportunity, was wisdom. Saving purely out of terror, with no vision for what the money might eventually build, was slow decay disguised as safety. He told Micah that every coin, every hour, and every ounce of energy should be asked the same question before being set aside. Is this resource growing towards something, or simply hiding from life? With that final lesson delivered, Elias closed his eyes and rested peacefully, leaving behind a grandson forever transformed by decades of patient wisdom. Lesson 15. Carrying the lesson forward. Years after his grandfather's passing, Micah became known throughout the region not merely as a skilled craftsman, but as a teacher of the same philosophy that had once seemed so strange to him as a frightened 17-year-old boy. He would often gather his own children and apprentices around the same workshop where Elias had once taught him, repeating the very story you have just heard, adapting it slightly with each telling but preserving its core truth completely intact. He taught them that fear of poverty often creates more poverty than poverty itself ever could, trapping generations in cycles of hoarding and anxiety rather than growth and contribution. He taught them that skills, relationships, generosity, and purposeful investment in oneself and others formed a kind of wealth that could never be stolen, burned, or lost to any market collapse. And he taught them, above all else, that the coins in your pocket matter far less than the direction in which you choose to point them. Whether you build walls of fear around a shrinking pile of metal, or plant seeds of skill and generosity that grow long after you are gone, is a choice available to every single person, regardless of how much or how little sits in their pocket today. Closing reflection. This story of Elias and Micah is a reminder that money itself has never been the true measure of a life well lived. It is merely a tool, A seed, a resource waiting for direction. The families who thrive across generations are rarely the ones who hoarded the most, but the ones who understood when to invest in skill, in people, in courage, and in purpose. If there is one lesson to carry forward from this grandfather's wisdom, let it be this. Never let fear convince you that hiding is the same as building, because a life spent guarding coins in the dark will always be smaller than a life spent planting seeds in the light. If this story moved you even slightly, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps these stories of wisdom, discipline, and timeless truth reach more people who are searching for guidance just like you were tonight. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with the lesson that struck you most deeply, and join this growing community of people committed to building lives of purpose rather than lives of fear. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.